The flight attendant smirked as she stepped in front of the elderly man's wheelchair, blocking his way. "Sir, first class is reserved for priority passengers. You can't sit here." The entire cabin fell silent. Passengers exchanged glances. Some whispered to one another, while others pretended not to notice. But no one, not even the flight crew, knew the truth. The man in the wheelchair wasn't just another traveler. He was the founder of the entire airline. And what happened next? No one saw it coming. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The airport was packed. Travelers rushed toward their gates, the sound of rolling suitcases clicking against the polished floors. Among them sat an elderly man in a wheelchair near the first-class boarding lane. He waited quietly, his posture upright, hands resting on the armrests. A faded military jacket hung loosely over his thin frame. His eyes, sharp yet calm, scanned the departure screens. His name was Walter Hughes, though those who knew him simply called him Sir out of respect. But today, respect was the last thing he would receive. A few feet away, Olivia Barrett, a flight attendant stationed at the gate, stood with her arms crossed, surveying the passengers. She prided herself on keeping order and ensuring everything went exactly the way she wanted. Her uniform was spotless, her brunette hair pulled into a flawless bun, and her expression sharp. When her gaze landed on Walter, a flicker of irritation crossed her face. He didn't look like he belonged in first class. He wasn't dressed in a tailored suit like the businessmen who usually occupied the front rows. He didn't carry an expensive briefcase. He didn't have the polished look of someone who had paid thousands for his ticket. With a firm step, she walked toward him, heels clicking against the tile, stopping directly in front of his wheelchair. "Sir, you'll need to wait for general boarding." "First-class passengers are boarding now," she said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. Walter looked up at her, his expression calm. "I am in first class," he stated evenly. Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line. She had dealt with this kind of thing before, passengers who had been mistakenly upgraded or somehow received a seat they hadn't actually paid for. "I think there's been a mistake," she said, holding out her hand. "Let me see your ticket." Without hesitation, Walter reached into his pocket, pulled out his boarding pass, and handed it to her. She barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "There must be an error." "Where did you get this ticket?" she asked, doubt laced in her voice. Walter tilted his head slightly, but before he could respond, Olivia turned to the gate agent standing nearby. "Can you check his ticket? There's no way." She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, but the meaning was clear. There was no way someone like him was supposed to be in first class. The gate agent, Ethan Wells, a younger employee, hesitated before scanning the ticket. A second later, the screen beeped, confirming its validity. "His ticket is correct," Ethan said, his voice uncertain as he glanced between Walter and Olivia. Olivia's jaw tightened, but she wasn't ready to back down. She turned back to Walter, her tone clipped. "Well, even if the ticket is correct, we need to ensure that your wheelchair won't obstruct the aisle. First class has limited space, and we must prioritize the comfort of our other passengers." Walter didn't flinch. "I've traveled before. I know the rules," he said simply. Olivia let out a quiet, frustrated breath. She didn't argue further but stepped aside dramatically, motioning for him to proceed. "Fine, just make sure you don't cause any inconvenience." Walter nodded slightly and wheeled himself forward toward the jet bridge. A few passengers who had witnessed the exchange shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away as if they hadn't seen anything, while others exchanged glances but said nothing. As Walter rolled onto the plane, Olivia followed closely behind, her irritation barely hidden. She quickened her pace, reaching the first-class cabin before he did. And when he arrived at his seat, she was already there, waiting, arms crossed. "Do you need help with your seatbelt?" the flight attendant asked, her tone dripping with impatience. "Or can you manage on your own?" Walter Hughes glanced up at her, recognizing the condescension in her voice instantly. He had encountered people like her before, those who assumed weakness based on appearances. "I can handle it," he replied simply. Olivia Barrett gave a curt nod before spinning on her heel and walking away. Just as she did, she muttered something under her breath. quiet enough that she thought he wouldn't hear. But Walter had spent years in situations where listening carefully was a necessity. He heard her words clearly. First class isn't what it used to be. He let the words settle in the air, watching as Olivia continued down the aisle. Her posture shifted immediately as she approached the well-dressed businessman in the next row, her expression lighting up with a warm, professional smile. She greeted him with an enthusiasm Walter had not been afforded. Walter adjusted his jacket and leaned back in his seat. He had faced far worse than rude flight attendants in his lifetime, but something told him this wasn't over. As the engines hummed to life and the plane prepared for takeoff, he had a feeling Olivia Barrett had just made the biggest mistake of her career. The plane rumbled as it taxied toward the runway, the deep vibration filling the cabin. Passengers settled in, flipping through in-flight magazines, adjusting their seatbelts, or scrolling absent-mindedly through their phones. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, performing their final checks. Olivia, still visibly annoyed, made her way through the first-class cabin, ensuring everyone was comfortable before takeoff. She stopped beside a middle-aged man in a tailored navy suit, her expression shifting into a warm, inviting smile. "Can I get you anything before we take off, Mr. Livingston?" she asked, her voice sweet and polite. The man glanced up and shook his head. "I'm good for now, thank you." Olivia nodded before moving on, offering the same level of friendliness to a woman carrying a designer handbag. She adjusted a tray table for another passenger, flashing a pleasant smile. But when she reached Walter Hughes, her demeanor changed. She barely spared him a glance. Walter noticed immediately. He hadn't expected special treatment, but the contrast was obvious. To some, she offered kindness and warmth. To him, she gave nothing but cold professionalism, acknowledging him only because she had to. Walter watched her interact with another flight attendant, Sophie Lane, who had been silently observing the situation. Sophie had only been with the airline for a year, but even she could tell something was off. "I'll take economy today," Olivia said suddenly, brushing past Sophie. "I'd rather not waste my time up here." Sophie hesitated. "But you were assigned to first class today." "It's fine," Olivia cut her off. "You handle it." Before Sophie could argue, Olivia disappeared toward the back of the plane, leaving her to finish the first-class service alone. Sophie let out a small sigh before turning toward Walter. "Sir, would you like something to drink before takeoff?" she asked gently. Walter looked up at her, studying her face. Unlike Olivia, Sophie didn't look annoyed or dismissive. She wasn't impatient or irritated. She actually seemed to care. "I'll take a coffee," Walter said, his voice calm. "Of course, sir. I'll bring that right over." As Sophie walked away, Walter glanced toward the front of the plane. Olivia might have thought she had avoided him, but he wasn't the type to let things go. He had seen people like her before, those who only respected wealth and appearances, not character. The intercom crackled as the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now cleared for takeoff. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened as we prepare to depart." Walter pulled the strap across his lap and secured it tightly. He had taken countless flights in his lifetime, but this one felt different. Today, he wasn't just another passenger. Today, he was a man watching a lesson unfold in real time. A lesson Olivia Barrett was about to learn the hard way. Across the aisle, Sophie returned with a steaming cup of coffee, carefully placing it on the tray table in front of Walter. "Here you go, sir. Let me know if you need anything else." Walter gave her a polite nod. "Thank you, young lady." Sophie smiled before moving on to serve the other passengers. Walter noticed how naturally she worked, how she treated every passenger with the same level of attentiveness, no matter their appearance. She wasn't just professional. She was the kind of flight attendant this airline needed more of. Meanwhile, in the galley at the back of the plane, Olivia leaned against the counter, arms crossed, irritation still etched across her face. She scrolled through her phone absent-mindedly, barely paying attention to the other flight attendants moving around her. She had no idea that, at that very moment, she was being watched, and that this flight would change her career forever. In the back galley, Olivia Barrett leaned against the counter, arms crossed, scrolling through her phone with an air of boredom. She barely acknowledged the other flight attendants moving around her. You were pretty hard on that guy in first class, said Jake Carter, one of her fellow crew members. He was younger than Olivia, but had been with the airline just as long. She scoffed. Did you see him? He doesn't belong up there. I don't know how he got that ticket, but I guarantee you he didn't pay for it. Jake frowned. So what? It's not our job to decide who belongs in first class. If his ticket's valid, that's all that matters. Olivia rolled her eyes. Come on, Jake, be real. First class is for high-paying customers, VIPs, not some old guy in a wheelchair who probably got a free upgrade. Jake shook his head. That's not your call to make. Olivia waved him off. Whatever. It's not like he'll complain. People like that don't make a fuss. She turned back to her phone, completely unaware that she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Back in first class, Walter Hughes took a slow sip of his coffee, his mind working. He wasn't a man who needed to announce his authority or demand respect. He had built a company from the ground up, led thousands of employees, and shaped the airline industry into what it was today. But if there was one thing he couldn't stand, it was people who abused their positions to make others feel small. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he composed a simple message and sent it. Then, he placed the phone back down and continued sipping his coffee, as if nothing had happened. Olivia had no idea that her actions had just set something much bigger in motion. The plane cruised at 35,000 feet, the soft hum of the engines blending with the occasional clinking of glasses and hushed conversations. Walter sat comfortably in his seat, his coffee now half finished, watching as the flight attendants moved through the cabin. Across the aisle, Sophie Lane was still tending to passengers, offering drinks and small gestures of kindness. Most didn't even notice, but Walter did. She treated everyone with the same level of respect, regardless of who they were. Meanwhile, Olivia Barrett had yet to return. In the back galley, she let out a frustrated sigh as she scrolled through her phone. To her, this was just another flight. Another routine day where she controlled the first-class experience. She had worked with the airline for years and thought she had seen it all. To her, certain people just didn't fit the image of luxury travel. That man in the wheelchair? She had convinced herself that he was a mistake, a glitch in the system. She had no regrets about how she treated him. But then, her earpiece crackled. Olivia, report to the cockpit immediately. She frowned, pushing herself upright. What could they possibly want? It wasn't normal for flight attendants to be called to the cockpit mid-flight unless it was serious. She made her way down the aisle, not bothering to acknowledge the first-class passengers. As she passed Walter Hughes, he looked at her, not with anger, not with irritation, but with something worse. Calm certainty. As if he already knew something she didn't. Olivia ignored the uneasy feeling in her gut and continued toward the front of the plane. When she entered the cockpit, Captain James Redding was waiting. He was a man of few words, but his presence alone was enough to make anyone straighten their posture. Next to him, on the small screen of the in-flight communication system, was a senior airline executive, David Langford. Olivia's stomach tightened slightly. "You called for me, Captain?" she asked, forcing her usual confident tone. Captain Redding wasted no time. "We just received a message from the executive office regarding a first-class passenger, Mr. Walter Hughes." Olivia frowned. "What about him?" David Langford cleared his throat on the screen. "Miss Barrett, are you aware of who Mr. Hughes is?" She hesitated. "Some retired veteran, I think," she said, her voice casual. The silence that followed was heavy. David Langford's voice was calm but firm. "Mr. Hughes isn't just some veteran. He is Walter Hughes, the founder of this airline." The words hit Olivia like a slap. Her breath caught. "What? You heard me," Langford continued. "The man you dismissed, the man you treated as an inconvenience, is the very person responsible for the company you work for, and he has personally reported an issue with your conduct." Olivia's face went pale. This wasn't just a minor complaint. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. This was career-ending. The captain exhaled through his nose, clearly displeased. "We need an explanation, now." Olivia's hands felt clammy as she struggled to find her words. I didn't know. I thought." "You thought," Langford interrupted, "that because he was in a wheelchair, because he didn't fit the image you had in your head, he didn't belong. Is that correct?" Olivia's throat felt dry. She had no good answer, no excuse that would save her. Langford's voice remained cold. When we land, you will personally apologize to Mr. Hughes in front of the first-class cabin, and depending on his decision, you may be facing further disciplinary action. Olivia swallowed hard. Further disciplinary action? The captain leaned forward. You may not have a job after this flight, Miss Barrett. Her heart pounded in her chest. The plane still had hours left in the air, but for her, it felt like it was already crashing. As Olivia stepped out of the cockpit, her legs felt unsteady beneath her. The door clicked shut behind her, but the weight of the conversation pressed down on her like a ton of bricks. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she slowly made her way back through the first-class cabin. Everything looked the same. Passengers were still in their seats, sipping drinks, reading books, or dozing off. The plane hummed steadily as it cut through the sky. But for Olivia, everything had changed. Her eyes flickered toward Walter Hughes, still seated calmly in 1A. His face was unreadable, but she knew he had heard the announcement calling her to the cockpit. He had been expecting it. Walter Hughes sat quietly in his seat, sipping his coffee. His expression was unreadable, calm, composed, almost as if he had already decided how this was going to end. That made Olivia Barrett feel even smaller. She hurried past him, avoiding his gaze as she ducked into the galley. Inside, Jake Carter was folding napkins for the meal service. He looked up immediately, noticing the tension in her posture. "You okay?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Olivia didn't answer right away. She pressed her palms against the counter, trying to steady her breathing. Finally, she whispered, "I screwed up." Jake frowned. "What are you talking about?" Olivia swallowed hard, her voice barely above a breath. "That old man in first class, the one in the wheelchair, he owns the airline. He's Walter Hughes. I treated him like he didn't belong." She exhaled sharply, "And now the executives know." Jake's hands froze mid-fold. His eyes widened slightly. "Wait, you're telling me the guy you dismissed, the one you barely acknowledged, is the founder of this entire airline?" Olivia nodded stiffly. "And he reported me." Jake let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Wow, you really messed up, didn't you?" Olivia shot him a sharp glare, but she couldn't argue. She had spent years controlling the cabin, deciding who got special treatment and who didn't. She had convinced herself that she was the authority, that she could judge who deserved respect based on their appearance. But today, she had made a judgment that might cost her everything. "They told me I have to apologize to him in front of everyone." Jake leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "And are you actually going to mean it?" Olivia flinched at the question. Was she sorry, or was she just sorry she got caught? She wasn't sure, but she did know one thing. This wasn't over. Not even close. Olivia took a deep breath, forcing herself to step out of the galley. The first-class cabin stretched before her, passengers lost in their own worlds, reading, sipping drinks, staring out the window. But she felt exposed, like every set of eyes was waiting for her to crack. She stole a glance at Walter Hughes. He hadn't moved. He still sat there, completely composed, as if nothing that had happened earlier had bothered him. That made it worse. She had expected some sort of reaction, anger, frustration, maybe even smug satisfaction. But there was nothing, just calm, quiet observation. Sophie Lane passed by, carrying a tray with fresh glasses of orange juice. She glanced at Olivia, picking up on the tension in her stiff posture. "Everything okay?" she asked. Olivia forced a tight nod. "Fine." Sophie hesitated for a moment, then lowered her voice. "Look, I don't know what happened up front, but if this is about Mr. Hughes, maybe you should just be honest with him." Olivia frowned. "What do you mean?" Sophie shrugged. "You treated him differently. You and I both know that. Maybe instead of focusing on what the airline is making you do, you should think about why you did it in the first place." Olivia bristled. She hated the way Sophie said it. So simple, as if the answer was right in front of her. But she didn't have time to argue. She squared her shoulders and made her way to Walter's seat. Her palms sweated as she stopped beside him, but she kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Hughes," she said, her voice controlled but quieter than usual. "I need to speak with you." Walter didn't look surprised. He slowly folded his hands in his lap and turned to face her. "Go ahead." Olivia hesitated. She had practiced her apology in her head on the way over. She had planned to say it was a misunderstanding. that she had simply been following procedure. But now, standing in front of him, the words felt wrong. She swallowed. I want to apologize for earlier. If I made you feel unwelcome in first class, that wasn't my intention. Walter didn't react right away. His gaze was steady, unreadable. Then he asked the one question she hadn't prepared for. Why did you assume I didn't belong here? A lump rose in Olivia's throat. That was the question. The one she had been avoiding. She forced a weak smile. It wasn't personal. She stopped herself. She had been about to say she was just doing her job. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, she had seen an old man in a wheelchair and made a snap decision. Walter tilted his head slightly. If I had walked onto this plane in a tailored suit instead of rolling in with a wheelchair, would you have questioned my ticket? Olivia opened her mouth, then closed it. She had no answer. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, Walter nodded, as if he had expected this outcome. You still have a lot to learn, he said simply. And just like that, Olivia realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about an apology. This was about whether or not she could truly face what she had done. She stood frozen beside his seat, breath shallow as his words settled over her. You still have a lot to learn. The sentence lingered in the air. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but somehow it was worse. He wasn't just disappointed. He had already decided she wasn't worth arguing with. That was the worst part. She forced herself to respond. I know I made a mistake. The words felt unnatural coming from her. She never had to admit fault before. I didn't mean. Walter lifted a hand slightly, cutting her off. You didn't mean to, but you did it anyway. Olivia swallowed. I assumed something that I shouldn't have, and I realize now that I was wrong. Walter studied her for a long moment. The hum of the plane filled the silence. She could feel the weight of his judgment, and for the first time in her career, she knew she deserved it. Walter Hughes exhaled quietly, leaning back in his seat. It's not me you need to convince, Miss Barrett. Olivia Barrett frowned. What do you mean? Walter gestured subtly around the cabin. You didn't just question me. You made sure everyone saw it. You made me feel small in front of an entire plane full of people. His voice was steady, but the message beneath it was clear. If you're truly sorry, you won't just say it to me. Olivia's stomach twisted. She already knew where this was going. She shook her head slightly, her voice dropping. You want me to apologize in front of everyone? Walter didn't blink. You didn't hesitate to humiliate me in front of them, so why should apologizing be any different? A tight knot formed in Olivia's chest. Apologizing privately had been difficult enough, but standing up in front of the entire first-class cabin, admitting publicly that she had treated him unfairly, was something else entirely. She felt the sudden, desperate urge to defend herself. I wasn't trying to humiliate you, she said quickly. Walter raised an eyebrow. Then what were you trying to do? She opened her mouth but hesitated. There was no good answer. She had made up her mind about him before he even spoke a word. She had seen an old man in a wheelchair, not wearing an expensive suit, and decided, on sight, that he wasn't supposed to be here. And now she was being forced to face that mistake, in front of everyone. Her hands clenched at her sides. I don't know if I can do that. Walter gave a small nod, as if that told him everything he needed to know. Then you haven't learned anything at all. And with that, he turned toward the window, dismissing her entirely. Olivia stood there, frozen. Her mind raced. She could walk away right now. She could pretend the conversation never happened, tell herself that apologizing in private had been enough. But deep down she knew that wasn't true. The weight of her actions pressed down on her. This wasn't just about saving her job anymore. This was about proving to Walter, to the passengers, and to herself that she was capable of change. But was she? She gripped the edge of the nearest seat for support, the quiet hum of the plane filling her ears. Passengers murmured over their drinks, flipping through magazines. But Olivia felt their eyes. Some stealing glances, others pretending not to notice. She had convinced herself, for years, that she was good at what she did, that she ran the first-class cabin with efficiency and authority. But today, she was realizing something ugly. She hadn't been serving. She had been controlling. She had used her authority to decide who mattered, and Walter Hughes had caught her in the act. She took a shaky breath and turned back toward him. Mr. Hughes? He didn't react. He didn't even look at her. He simply continued staring out the window, watching the clouds roll past, as if she wasn't even there. She swallowed hard. Her voice came out quieter than before. "You're right." That made him turn. His gaze was steady, waiting. He didn't say anything. Olivia took a slow breath. Her pride clawed at her throat, begging her to stop, to make an excuse, to walk away. But something else, the part of her that had been forced to face the truth, kept her standing there. "I was wrong." She said it louder this time. A few passengers turned their heads, curious, listening. Olivia forced herself to keep going. "When I saw you in that wheelchair, when I saw your jacket, the way you carried yourself, I assumed things about you that I had no right to assume." She hesitated, then she pushed through. "I thought you didn't belong in first class." More passengers turned. She could feel their eyes on her now. "I thought I knew who was supposed to sit here and who wasn't." She swallowed, "But I didn't." Her voice wavered, "And for that, I'm sorry." Walter studied her carefully. Then he asked the one question she hadn't prepared for. "Why are you telling me this now?" Olivia Barrett's fingers dug into her palm. "Because he gave me a choice." Walter Hughes's expression didn't change, but his gaze sharpened, as if he was measuring her sincerity. She took a step back, breathing in deeply. Then she did something she never thought she would have to do. She turned to face the entire first-class cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice trembling slightly but still strong. Passengers looked up. Her stomach twisted, but she kept going. "Before we continue this flight, I need to take a moment to address something." Now, everyone was looking. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she forced herself to speak. "Earlier today, I made a mistake. A serious one. I treated a passenger unfairly, based on an assumption that should never have been made. I questioned his place in first class, not because of his ticket, but because of my own bias." A few murmurs rippled through the cabin. Olivia's hands trembled slightly. But she didn't stop. "That passenger is Mr. Walter Hughes. Some of you may know who he is. Some of you may not. But what you should know is that he is not just a first-class passenger. He is the founder of this airline." The murmurs grew louder. Passengers exchanged glances. Even those who hadn't been paying attention before were locked onto her now. She forced herself to look at Walter again. "Mr. Hughes, I want to publicly apologize to you, not just because of who you are, but because of what I did. I was wrong, and I am truly sorry." Silence. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest. Walter sat there, his expression unreadable. For the first time in her career, Olivia felt completely out of control. She wasn't calling the shots anymore. She wasn't the authority in the room. Walter Hughes was. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "Once. That's a start." The breath Olivia had been holding finally escaped. A ripple of quiet whispers spread through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some pretended not to watch. Others openly observed, taking in the scene unfolding before them. The tension still hung thick in the air, but something had shifted. Olivia stood there, frozen, her hands still clenched at her sides. She had done it. She had forced the words out, spoken them aloud in a way that made them impossible to take back. But instead of relief, she felt something else. Unease. Walter had acknowledged her apology, but the way he said it, "That's a start." That meant this wasn't over. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to remain professional. "I'll be checking in on everyone shortly. Please don't hesitate to let me know if you need anything." It was an attempt to bring the moment back to normal, to shift attention away from herself. Some passengers nodded, others looked away, but she could still feel their judgment. The apology was out there now, and she had no choice but to own it. She turned and walked stiffly back toward the galley. The moment she was behind the curtain, she pressed her hands flat against the counter, sucking in a deep breath. What had she just done? Her mind raced. She had never had to apologize like that before, especially not in front of an audience. The humiliation still burned at the edges of her nerves, but beneath that, something deeper, something uncomfortable. She had just admitted, out loud, that she had judged someone unfairly, that she had let her assumptions control her actions. And the worst part? She had done it so easily. She hadn't even thought twice when she dismissed Walter earlier. It had been automatic, a decision made without real consideration. And now, Standing in the galley, she realized something that made her stomach twist. How many times had she done this before, without realizing it? How many other passengers had she treated differently, just because they didn't fit her expectations? How many people had she ignored, dismissed, or made feel small, simply because they didn't look like they belonged in first class? Her hands curled into fists against the counter. Was this who she had always been? A soft voice pulled her out of her thoughts. That was brave. Olivia turned sharply. Sophie Lane stood nearby, watching her with an unreadable expression. Olivia let out a slow breath. It didn't feel brave. Sophie leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. That's because you're actually thinking about what you did. Olivia frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Sophie shrugged. I've worked with flight attendants who would have done exactly what you did earlier, but if they got caught, they wouldn't care. They'd only apologize because they had to, not because they meant it. Olivia bristled. And you think I meant it? Sophie studied her for a moment. I think you're starting to. Olivia looked away, jaw tight. Starting to. She wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. And then, the intercom crackled to life. The intercom crackled, breaking the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet with an estimated landing time of 2:15 p.m. The weather at our destination is clear and warm with a slight breeze. We hope you're enjoying your flight. Olivia Barrett straightened, adjusting her uniform. I should get back to work, she muttered. Sophie Lane didn't stop her, but before Olivia stepped away, she said one last thing. You know, real change doesn't happen in a single apology. Olivia's shoulders stiffened. She didn't turn around. But she heard the meaning behind Sophie's words loud and clear. Saying sorry was one thing. Proving it was another. She exhaled slowly, then pushed through the curtain and back into the cabin. Her gaze immediately landed on Walter Hughes. He was still seated in 1A, but this time, he wasn't looking out the window. He was looking directly at her. Olivia hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she squared her shoulders and stepped forward. She had made her apology, but now she had to prove that she meant it. Moving through the first-class cabin, Olivia felt every glance in her direction. Even though the passengers had returned to their books, movies, or quiet conversations, she could still feel the weight of her public apology hanging in the air. She wasn't used to this, being on the other side of scrutiny. For years she had controlled this space. She had been the one to decide who received extra attention, who got a warm smile, and who was barely acknowledged. She had told herself it was just part of the job. First-class passengers expected a certain level of service, and she had learned to prioritize those who fit the role of wealth and importance. Now, she realized just how blind she had been. She stopped in front of Walter's seat. Would you like anything else, Mr. Hughes? Walter looked up at her. His expression was still unreadable. Just water, please. Olivia nodded quickly, almost relieved by the simplicity of the request. She turned and went straight to the galley, grabbing a cold bottle of water and a glass with ice. She moved on instinct, performing the task just as she had 1,000 times before. But as she placed the tray in front of Walter, he did something unexpected. He studied her, not in a condescending way, not like he was waiting for her to mess up again. He simply watched her as if he was trying to understand something. She shifted under the weight of his gaze. Is there anything else I can do for you, sir? Walter tilted his head slightly. Then, he asked a question she wasn't prepared for. Do you believe what you said earlier? Olivia's stomach tightened. She hesitated, caught off guard. Did she believe it? When she stood up in front of the entire cabin and admitted her mistake, she had done it because she had no choice. She had been called out, exposed, and while she had meant her words in the moment, the deeper questions still lingered. Had she really changed, or had she just said what she needed to say to survive? She cleared her throat, choosing her words carefully. I think I'm beginning to understand what I did wrong. Walter gave a slow nod as if considering her answer. Then he leaned back slightly in his seat. You know, he said, I started this airline for people like me. Olivia frowned. What do you mean? Walter exhaled, looking out the window for a moment before continuing. I served my country for 30 years. When I came home, I was different. Not just because of my injuries, but because the world saw me differently. His voice remained calm, but Olivia felt the weight of his words. I went from leading troops in combat to struggling to get a taxi to stop for me. I lost the ability to walk, and somehow, that made people assume I lost my value too. Something tightened in Olivia's chest. Walter glanced back at her. So when I built this airline, I made sure that every passenger, regardless of how they looked, how much money they had, or where they came from, was treated with the same respect. His eyes met hers. Because I know what it feels like to be judged before you even open your mouth. Olivia swallowed hard. I didn't know. Walter gave a small smile. Of course, you didn't. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't meant to humiliate her. It was simply the truth. She had never thought about it before. She had spent years believing that first class belonged to a certain type of person, never questioning who set those rules. She had never stopped to think about the passengers who didn't fit the image, but had every right to be there. And now, she was face to face with the man who had created this very airline to break that mindset. A lump rose in her throat. Walter took a slow sip of his water before setting it down. You apologized? That's good. Then his expression turned serious. But an apology only matters if it leads to change. Olivia nodded stiffly, trying to push past the discomfort curling in her stomach. I understand. Walter's gaze stayed on her for a second longer, then he nodded. We'll see. Olivia turned quickly, walking back toward the galley. Before her emotions betrayed her. For the first time since stepping onto this flight, she felt something unfamiliar creeping into her thoughts. Not just regret, but reflection. She had spent years thinking she knew this job inside and out. But now, for the first time, she was realizing just how much she still had to learn. She gripped the edge of the counter in the galley, her breathing slow and controlled. The reality of the past few hours was starting to settle into her bones. He was right. An apology wasn't enough. She had to prove it. For years, Olivia Barrett had moved through flights like clockwork, handling passengers, enforcing rules, and keeping everything in perfect order. But this feeling was something entirely new. Uncertainty. Self-doubt. She had never questioned herself before. Never had a moment where she genuinely wondered whether she had been doing things the wrong way all along. But Walter Hughes had cracked something open inside her. She had dismissed him without hesitation. She had questioned his right to be in first class before she even looked at his ticket. And now, he wasn't just another passenger. He was the very person who had built the airline she worked for. And he had built it for people like him. People she had ignored. A voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Still thinking about it, huh? She turned sharply to see Jake Carter leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching her. Olivia let out a slow breath. I don't have a choice. Jake raised an eyebrow. You always have a choice, you just didn't think about it before. Olivia shot him a glare. But he wasn't wrong. Jake reached for a bottle of water from the fridge, twisting off the cap casually. Look, he said, I've worked with you long enough to know that you don't mess up often. But when you do, you double down instead of admitting it. Olivia narrowed her eyes. That's not true. Jake smirked. Isn't it? He took a sip before continuing. You could have just apologized to Walter quietly, right? But instead, you made a scene. Then, when the captain called you in, you still tried to act like it wasn't a big deal. He tilted his head slightly. And now you're actually thinking about it. That's new. Olivia exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. Why do I feel like you're enjoying this? Jake shrugged. Because it's not often that Olivia Barrett doesn't have all the answers. She wanted to be annoyed. But the truth was, he was right. She had spent years being so sure of herself, so convinced that she understood this job better than anyone. But now, she was realizing just how little she actually understood about the people she was supposed to be serving. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a phone buzzing. She turned her head slightly, noticing the in-flight phone on the wall blinking. That was unusual. Most communication from the ground only happened in emergencies. Jake frowned and picked it up. Flight 281, first class cabin. This is Jake speaking. He paused. The voice on the other end responded. Jake's expression shifted. His eyes widened slightly. Olivia felt a prickle of unease. What? Jake lowered the receiver, his face unreadable. The airline's corporate office just sent a request. They want a meeting with you after we land. Olivia's stomach dropped. What? Jake nodded, setting the phone back in its holder. Yep, apparently Walter Hughes wants a full report on how this flight was handled, and that means they're going to be reviewing everything. His eyes met hers. Including you. Olivia felt her pulse quicken. She had assumed the worst was over after she apologized. She had done the one thing she thought was needed to smooth this over. But this wasn't just about a single mistake anymore. Walter was making sure this wouldn't be forgotten. She swallowed hard. Do you think they're going to fire me? Jake studied her for a moment before answering. Honestly, I don't know. Olivia turned away, gripping the counter. Her mind raced. She had spent the entire flight trying to repair the damage she had done. But what if it wasn't enough? What if an apology didn't erase the fact that she had exposed exactly who she was? Someone who made snap judgments. Someone who decided who belonged where. Someone who never even questioned whether she was being fair. Her breath felt tight in her chest. She had spent years enforcing the rules. But now, for the first time, she was the one being judged. And this time, she had no control over the verdict. She gripped the counter tighter, staring blankly at the silverware neatly stacked beside her. The reality of the situation pressed in from all sides. She had thought that standing in front of the first-class cabin and apologizing to Walter would be the hardest part. But now, she realized that the real challenge hadn't even begun. The corporate office wanted a meeting. That meant this wasn't just about a passenger complaint. This was bigger. Walter Hughes wasn't just letting this go, and if the airline executives were involved, that meant decisions were being made about her future. Even as she stood there, frozen in place, Jake shifted beside her, watching her reaction carefully. You should start preparing yourself now, Olivia. They're not going to be easy on you. Olivia scoffed, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. You think I don't know that? Jake held up his hands. I'm just saying, this is Walter Hughes we're talking about. He doesn't do things halfway. Olivia turned sharply to face him. What does that mean? Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I don't know him personally. But everyone in the industry knows what kind of man he is. He looked her straight in the eye. He built this airline from the ground up, and he actually cares about how people are treated. He's respected, not just because he built a successful airline, but because he actually cares about the way people are treated. Jake Carter's words hung in the air. Olivia Barrett crossed her arms. And you think I don't care? Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Do you? Olivia opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Did she? She had spent years believing she was good at her job, that she ran first class efficiently, that she knew how to handle difficult passengers, that she understood what was expected of her. But the truth was, she had never really cared about the people in the seats. She had cared about control. She had cared about order. She had cared about making sure first class stayed exactly how she thought it should be. Polished, expensive, predictable. And today, that belief had shattered. She swallowed hard, suddenly feeling lightheaded. She needed to get out of this galley. I need some air, she muttered, stepping past Jake before he could respond. She pushed through the curtain and into the first-class cabin. The passengers barely noticed her, except for one, Walter Hughes. He wasn't looking out the window anymore. He wasn't pretending to ignore what had happened. He was watching her. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she moved past his row, heading toward the small crew area near the front of the plane. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a brief moment, trying to breathe. This was just another flight, just another situation to handle. Except it wasn't. Nothing about this was routine. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a bottle of water, twisting off the cap and taking a slow sip. She had faced difficult passengers before. Rude businessmen who snapped their fingers at her. Entitled travelers who demanded the impossible. She had learned to brush it off, to keep moving, to stay in control. But this wasn't some rude passenger. This was the owner of the airline, a man who had built everything she took for granted. A man who had lived through struggles she had never even considered, a man she had insulted, dismissed, and humiliated without a second thought. And now, he held her career in his hands. A voice startled her out of her thoughts. Running away isn't going to change anything. Olivia turned to see Sophie Lane standing nearby, arms folded. Olivia huffed. I'm not running. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Then what are you doing? Olivia glanced past her back toward the cabin. She could still feel Walter's presence, the weight of his stare. Even though she wasn't looking directly at him, she exhaled slowly. I don't know. Sophie studied her carefully. You've been a flight attendant for what, 6 years? 7, Olivia corrected automatically. Sophie nodded. And in those 7 years, how many times have you actually thought about the way you treat passengers? Olivia's jaw tightened. I treat passengers just fine. Sophie tilted her head. Do you? Olivia's fingers curled around the water bottle. What do you want me to say, Sophie? That I was wrong? That I should have treated Walter Hughes differently? That I should have treated all passengers differently? Sophie didn't flinch. I don't want you to say anything. I just want you to think about it. Olivia let out a sharp breath. I've been thinking about it. Sophie gave a small nod. Good. Because Walter Hughes isn't just going to accept an apology and let this go. He's testing you, Olivia. He wants to see what kind of person you really are. Olivia frowned. And what if he doesn't like what he sees? Sophie held her gaze. Then you lose everything. The word sent a chill down Olivia's spine. She wanted to argue, to push back, to say that she didn't need anyone's approval. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had spent years believing she had authority. But today, she had learned that authority meant nothing if it wasn't backed by respect. And for the first time in 7 years, Olivia wasn't sure if she had ever earned it. She swallowed hard, straightened her uniform, and turned back toward the first-class cabin. She couldn't change what had already happened. But maybe, just maybe, she could change what happened next. She walked back into the first-class cabin, each step feeling heavier than the last. She had spent years thinking she was in control, but today, she was realizing just how little control she actually had. The passengers around her had moved on, some sleeping, some sipping their drinks, some watching movies. But to Olivia, the weight of what had happened still sat in the air, thick, unmoving. She glanced toward Walter Hughes. He was now flipping through the airline's in-flight magazine. His expression was unreadable. Even though he wasn't looking at her, Olivia knew he was still watching, not in an obvious way, but in the way a man like him always watched. Quietly, calculating, waiting to see what she would do next. Her apology had been step 1, but now, she knew something far worse was coming. The meeting. Olivia Barrett's hands tightened at her sides. The corporate office had already been informed. Walter Hughes had made sure of it. That meant, the moment this plane touched down, she would be stepping into a room full of executives, forced to defend herself, forced to answer for something she couldn't take back. She had been in difficult situations before. She had argued with drunk and disorderly passengers. She had handled emergency landings. She had even been forced to remove people from flights. But this was the first time she was the one on trial. She turned, moving toward the galley, grabbing a glass of water in hopes that it would steady her nerves. She barely noticed Jake Carter stepping in behind her. "You good?" he asked casually, leaning against the counter. Olivia scoffed. "Do I look good?" Jake smirked. "Not really. You look like you just got sentenced to life in prison." Olivia rolled her eyes, taking a slow sip of water. "Might as well be." Jake nodded. "Yeah, I heard about the meeting." Then he added, almost too casually, "And I also heard that Walter Hughes is the kind of guy who doesn't forget things like this." Olivia exhaled sharply. "Great. That makes me feel so much better." Jake shrugged. "I'm just saying, if you go in there acting like you're only sorry because you got caught, they'll eat you alive." He leaned forward slightly. "You need to decide right now, what are you actually fighting for? Are you fighting to keep your job, or are you fighting to prove you've actually learned something?" Olivia frowned, turning to him fully. "Aren't those the same thing?" Jake shook his head. "Not even close." Her jaw tightened. "Then what do you think I should do? Give some emotional speech? Beg for another chance?" Jake held up his hands. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you that Walter Hughes is watching you. Every move you make from now until we land is going to determine what he tells the corporate office. You need to decide, Are you going to pretend to be the perfect flight attendant for the rest of this flight? Or are you actually going to prove that you can change? Olivia's stomach twisted. She didn't like being told she was being tested. She had spent years believing she was the one testing others. Passengers, new flight attendants, anyone who stepped into her first-class cabin. She had been the one with power. But now she was the one being judged. And the worst part? She wasn't sure if she would pass the test. She took another sip of water before setting the glass down, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. You really think he's paying that much attention? Jake smirked. Oh, I know he is. Then he added, lowering his voice, and I also know that when we land, the executives aren't going to ask you how you feel about this. They're going to ask him. They're going to ask Walter Hughes if he believes you deserve to stay here. Olivia's pulse pounded. It was worse than she thought. She had assumed she would get a standard review, maybe a suspension, maybe a warning. But if the decision was being left up to Walter Hughes, that meant she wasn't walking into a corporate review. She was walking into a sentencing. She turned back toward the first-class cabin, forcing herself to stand straighter. Her hands smoothed out the front of her uniform. If she was going to prove she had changed, she needed to start now. No more avoiding eye contact, no more waiting for the flight to end. She had to step up. Her eyes scanned the cabin, looking for any passenger who needed assistance. Normally, she would have focused on the wealthy businessman first, the ones who expected top-tier service. But this time, she forced herself to see everyone. A few rows back, an older woman struggled to reach her carry-on bag. Her frail arms stretched toward the overhead bin, but she couldn't quite get a grip on it. Olivia moved before she had time to think. She stepped up beside the woman, her voice softer than usual. "Let me help you with that, ma'am." The woman turned, relief flooding her expression. "Oh, thank you, dear. My arms aren't as strong as they used to be." Olivia smiled. A real one this time. "That's what I'm here for." She gently lifted the bag and secured it back in the bin before stepping aside. "If you need anything else, just press your call button, okay?" The woman nodded gratefully. "You're very kind, dear." Olivia hesitated for half a second, then nodded back. "I try to be." As she turned away, her gaze instinctively flicked toward Walter. He was still watching, and this time, he nodded. Just slightly, just enough for her to notice. Olivia exhaled. This wasn't about grand speeches, Lex. This wasn't about dramatic gestures. This was about proving, moment by moment, that she wasn't the same person who had dismissed him at the gate. She had 7 years of bad habits to undo, and only a few hours left to prove she could. Something shifted inside her. Something she couldn't quite put into words. She had spent the last few years believing she understood what it meant to be a flight attendant. Keep order, maintain control, prioritize first-class passengers who fit the standard. That was how she had operated. She had never questioned it, because she had never been forced to. Until now. Now, she was seeing everything differently. She moved through the cabin with new awareness. For the first time, she wasn't just checking off tasks or going through the motions. She was paying attention. A few rows ahead, a young man in a wrinkled button-up shirt sat near the window. His foot nervously bounced as he tapped his phone screen over and over. She had seen passengers like him before. Nervous flyers, first-timers, or maybe someone with bad experiences on planes. And this time, she wasn't going to ignore him. She stepped forward. The young man in the window seat tapped his phone screen nervously, his leg bouncing in a restless rhythm. Normally, Olivia Barrett wouldn't have noticed. But now she saw everything. The tension in his shoulders, the way he exhaled sharply every time the plane jolted slightly, the way his fingers hovered over the screen, like he was trying to distract himself, but failing. She walked over, keeping her voice calm but natural. "Can I get you anything?" The man startled slightly, blinking up at her. "Oh, no, I'm fine." Olivia didn't move. "You sure?" A brief pause, then finally a quiet sigh. "First time flying?" she asked. He let out a breathless laugh. "First time in a long time." He gestured toward the window. "I used to travel a lot, but then I had a bad flight a few years ago. Haven't been able to get back on a plane since." Olivia nodded. Normally she would have moved on by now, but instead, she leaned slightly toward him, lowering her voice. "You know what helped me when I started flying?" The man tilted his head, curious. What? Distraction. She smiled slightly. Movies, music, even just talking to someone. You don't have to sit in silence and let your thoughts get the best of you. She glanced at his screen. Want a recommendation? We have some really bad action movies on the entertainment system that are actually kind of great. The man chuckled softly. The tension in his shoulders eased just a little. All right, hit me with your best, so bad it's good movie. Olivia smirked. Shark Tornado 3. It's exactly what it sounds like. The man let out a real laugh this time. That sounds terrible, Olivia nodded. It is, and it's perfect. She moved on before he could thank her. But as she walked away, she saw him scrolling through the in-flight entertainment options, looking for the movie. And for the first time in a long time, Olivia felt like she had actually helped someone. She turned back toward the galley, but before she reached it, her eyes caught Walter Hughes once again. He was still watching, not with the quiet judgment she had seen before. Now there was something different in his expression. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, he believed she was trying. The flight continued smoothly. But for Olivia, it was anything but routine. She spent the next hour moving through the cabin, actively looking for ways to improve the experience for every passenger. She helped a mother calm her fussy toddler by offering a coloring book. She refilled drinks before people even had to ask. She made sure that every passenger, regardless of whether they were wearing a business suit or a hoodie, was treated with the same level of attentiveness. It was exhausting, but something strange was happening. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was forcing a performance. She actually felt like she was doing her job the way it was meant to be done. And the more she did it, the more she realized how much she had been missing. She had spent years prioritizing passengers who expected to be treated like VIPs, never thinking about the ones who didn't demand attention, but deserved it just as much. Now she was seeing them all, and she wasn't just seeing them, she was serving them. The final stretch of the flight approached. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into our destination. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure all tray tables are in the upright position. Flight attendants will be coming around for final checks. Thank you for flying with us. Olivia moved through the cabin one last time, checking seatbelts, collecting last-minute trash, making sure everything was in order. When she reached Walter's row, she hesitated. He looked up at her, waiting. She took a steady breath before speaking. Do you need anything else before we land, Mr. Hughes? For the first time since the flight began, Walter smiled. No, I think I'm good. Olivia nodded. All right, if you change your mind, let me know. She turned to walk away. But before she could take a step, Walter's voice stopped her. Miss Barrett? She turned back. Yes, sir? Walter studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he gave a single nod. You did well today. Olivia's throat tightened. She wasn't sure why, but those 4 words meant more to her than she expected. She didn't trust herself to speak right away, so she simply nodded back. Thank you, sir. Walter didn't say anything else. He simply turned back toward the window, as if that single sentence had been all that needed to be said. But Olivia knew what it meant. The test wasn't just about what she had done in the past. It was about what she was willing to do to be better. And today, she had proved that she could be. But the real question was still waiting for her. The moment they landed, she would have to face the corp office. And even though Walter had acknowledged her efforts, his opinion wasn't the only one that mattered. Would the executives see what he had seen? Or was it too late to convince them? Olivia didn't know. But this time, she was ready to find out. The plane's wheels touched down with a slight jolt. The soft hum of the engines shifted as they reversed thrust to slow the aircraft. Around her, passengers began stirring, stretching their arms, collecting their belongings. The end of the flight was always the busiest moment for a flight attendant, coordinating deplaning, making sure everyone exited smoothly, ensuring no items were left behind. But for Olivia Barrett, this landing wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The aircraft taxied toward the gate, the familiar hum of the engines fading as the journey came to an end. Around Olivia Barrett, passengers began stirring, stretching their arms, collecting their belongings. For most of them, this was just another flight. But for Olivia, this landing wasn't just the end of a flight, it was the beginning of something much bigger. Her pulse pounded in her ears. At any moment, Walter Hughes would be stepping off this plane. And soon after, she would be walking into a meeting that could decide the rest of her career. Would she be fired, suspended, given another chance? She had no way of knowing. The seatbelt sign switched off with a soft ding, and passengers immediately reached for their bags. Olivia stood near the exit, hands clasped in front of her, forcing herself to focus. She still had a job to do. And no matter what happened after today, she was going to finish it properly. One by one, passengers trickled out. The businessman she had served earlier gave her a polite nod as he passed. The nervous young man who had watched Shark Tornado 3 on her recommendation gave her a small smile and a thumbs up. The elderly woman she had helped with her bag whispered a soft, "Thank you, dear," before stepping off the plane. Every interaction reminded Olivia of something she had never truly understood before today. It wasn't about who people were, it was about how you treated them. And then, Walter Hughes stood up. Most of the first-class passengers had already exited. Only a few remained, lingering in the back. Olivia braced herself as Walter slowly adjusted his jacket, straightened his posture, and rolled his wheelchair toward the exit. He stopped just inches from her. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Then, in a calm and measured voice, Walter said the words she had been waiting for. "You did well, Miss Barrett." Olivia felt something shift inside her. It wasn't praise, not really. It wasn't forgiveness either. It was acknowledgement. A sign that he had seen her, not just her mistake, but her efforts to correct it. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Thank you, sir." Walter nodded once, then turned and rolled off the plane, disappearing down the jet bridge. Olivia exhaled sharply, her hands gripping the fabric of her uniform. She wasn't sure what that moment truly meant, but she had a feeling. She was about to find out soon. The meeting. The meeting was scheduled for 30 minutes after landing. Olivia barely had time to finish her post-flight duties before heading toward the executive offices. Her steps felt heavier with each one she took. The weight of everything pressed down on her. She had made mistakes. She had owned up to them. But was that enough? When she arrived at the corporate office lounge, she was met by a sharp-eyed woman in a navy suit. "Olivia Barrett?" Olivia straightened. "Yes." The woman gave her a brief once-over before gesturing for her to follow. "This way." The hallway leading to the meeting room felt endless. Each step echoed slightly, making the tension even worse. Olivia forced herself to breathe evenly. To stay calm, she had prepared for a room full of executives, a boardroom packed with higher-ups, all ready to fire her. But when the doors finally opened, she stepped inside and immediately felt the air shift. Because the room wasn't filled with executives, there wasn't a panel of corporate officials waiting to judge her. There was only one person. Walter Hughes. Olivia stopped short, blinking in surprise. Walter sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, his hands folded in front of him, the quiet authority of a man who held her future in his hands. His voice was calm, even, not cruel, not angry, just expectant. "Please, have a seat." Olivia slowly lowered herself into the chair across from him, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. She hesitated before speaking. "I thought this was a corporate review." She hated how cautious her voice sounded. Walter smiled slightly. "It is." Then he leaned back. "But as it turns out, the executives trust my judgment on this matter." Olivia swallowed hard. So this was it, her career, her future. It was in Walter Hughes' hands. Walter studied her closely. Then finally he spoke. "Tell me something, Miss Barrett." Walter Hughes fixed his gaze on Olivia Barrett, his expression calm yet unwavering. "Miss Barrett, why do you want to keep this job?" Olivia hesitated, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wanted to say the right one. She had spent the entire flight proving something, not just to him, but to herself. Now she had to put it into words. Finally, she took a breath. "Because I want to do it right this time." Walter gave a slight nod, as if he had been expecting that response, but his next question cut deeper. "And why should I believe you?" Olivia straightened her posture, keeping her gaze locked on his. "Because I understand what I did wrong. I can't undo it, but I can make sure it never happens again." Walter studied her, unreadable. So Olivia kept going. I thought being a flight attendant was about control. Keeping everything in order, making sure nothing went wrong, she exhaled. But it's not. It's about service. It's about the people. And today I finally understood that. Walter leaned back slightly in his chair. His expression remained neutral, but his words were anything but. You were arrogant, dismissive, quick to judge. Olivia didn't flinch. I was. She wasn't going to make excuses. Not anymore. Walter let the silence settle before speaking again. You're not a bad flight attendant, Miss Barrett. For a brief moment, relief flickered inside her. But before today, you were a selfish one, and that's worse. The words hit harder than she expected, because they weren't cruel. They were simply true. Walter exhaled, leaning forward slightly. You have one chance. Olivia's breath caught. One chance? He nodded. You won't be fired. But for the next 6 months, every flight you work will be monitored. If I hear even one report that you've fallen back into old habits. He met her eyes. You're done. No warnings, no second chances. Understood? Olivia's response was immediate. Understood. Walter stood, adjusting his jacket. Then we're done here. Olivia got to her feet as well, though her legs felt weak beneath her. She wasn't sure what to say. Thank you? I'm sorry again? But before she could speak, Walter gave her one last look. You can either prove me wrong, his eyes didn't waver, or prove me right. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She wasn't fired, she wasn't suspended, but she had been given a choice. Stay the same or actually change. And this time, she was going to prove Walter Hughes right.